The letter hit the marshal's desk with a sound like a gunshot in the silence of that dusty afternoon office, and Josephine Harper's hands were trembling so badly she could barely keep them flat against the worn pine surface. She had ridden 40 miles through rattlesnake country and blistering July heat to get here, to this man, to this moment. The wax seal on the envelope, dark crimson, pressed with a falcon in mid-dive, stared up between them like an accusation neither of them had made yet. Marshal Jasper Brenner had been reaching for his coffee mug when she set the letter down. He stopped. His hand hung in the air for one suspended second, and then he lowered it very slowly, the way a man lowers a weapon when he realizes the fight is not what he expected it to be. His gray eyes dropped to the seal, and something moved behind them that Josephine could not name, something dark and tightly wound, like a coil of wire under pressure. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out low and controlled, the voice of a man who had spent years making sure nothing unraveled him in public. But his jaw had tightened visibly, and a muscle jumped once beneath his left cheekbone. "It was hidden in my father's floorboards," Josephine said. "I found it 3 days ago when I was clearing the house after his funeral. It was sealed. It has never been opened." She paused, forcing herself to hold his gaze even though every instinct told her to look away. "I recognize that seal. I have seen it before, Marshal, on correspondence that passed through my father's hands when I was 17, correspondence that terrified him." Jasper Brenner straightened. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with hard work and harder living. And when he stood at his full height, he seemed to take up a different kind of space in the room. Not threatening. Something more complicated than that. He looked at the letter for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he said 4 words that detonated everything Josephine Harper thought she understood about her own life. "I know the sender." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the wind against the shutters, the distant sound of a horse being watered at the trough outside, the shallow, unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. Because if Jasper Brenner recognized that seal, if he knew who had sent a secret letter to her murdered father, and she was absolutely certain now that her father had been murdered, no matter what the county coroner's report said about a bad heart, then the web of betrayal she had been trying to map in the dark for 3 days had just acquired a center. And the center was standing right here in this office. She had not known, when she saddled her horse before dawn and rode through the painted darkness of the New Mexico territory toward the town of Red Rock, that this errand would change everything. She had known only that she was afraid, that her father was dead, and that the letter was dangerous. She had not known that the Marshal of Red Rock would look at that dark red seal and go still like a man who has just seen something return from a place he thought it buried. She had not known she would feel, beneath her terror, the absolutely bewildering pull of wanting to trust him. It had started, as most disasters do, quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary texture of an ordinary life. Josephine Harper had grown up on a cattle spread 30 miles south of Red Rock in the territory of New Mexico, in the year 1883. Her father, William Harper, had been a good man of limited fortune and extensive principle, the kind of man who kept his word and his fences in equal repair. Her mother had died when Josephine was 11, and in the years since, she and her father had built between them a partnership of the quiet, practical kind. She kept the accounts, he kept the cattle, and together they kept the spread alive through drought and cattle sickness and the grinding uncertainty of frontier life. She was 26 now, which in the town of Red Rock made her something of a curiosity. Women in the territory married young, in general, or they didn't marry at all, and the ones who didn't marry were generally understood to have specific reasons for it. Josephine had specific reasons, though she kept them private. She had been engaged once at 20 to a man named Carter Doyle who had seemed steady and kind and turned out to be neither. And after that particular education, she had developed a preference for her own company that most of Red Rock's male population had learned, through a series of politely devastating refusals, not to challenge. She had seen Jasper Brenner from a distance, the way everyone in the territory saw the marshal across a street at the edge of a gathering, the kind of man who occupied the frame of a doorway differently than other men. He had been Marshal of Redrock for 4 years. Before that, rumor placed him in various locations across the territory in various capacities, none of them entirely comfortable. He was 32 years old. He was not married. He did not talk about himself in the way that men who have nothing to hide generally do not bother to guard themselves. He guarded himself constantly, and that in itself told a story that Josephine, who was observant by nature, had filed away without knowing exactly why. She had spoken to him twice before the day she brought him the letter. Once when she rode into Redrock to report a fence cutting on the eastern boundary of her father's property, a preliminary act of harassment that she had correctly identified as belonging to a pattern. And once when she ran into him outside the general store and he had, without being asked, helped her load a heavy bag of flour into her wagon. Both times he had been formal and precise and careful, the way a man is when he is working very hard to be seen in a particular light. She had noticed that too. The fence cutting had been the beginning of it, though she had not understood that then. The Harper spread was not large by territory standards, but it sat on good grass with reliable water access, which in New Mexico in 1883 made it valuable in ways that went beyond the cattle that walked on it. There were men in the territory, powerful men with lawyers in Santa Fe and senators in their correspondence, who wanted that land, and they had a long history of getting what they wanted through methods that were technically difficult to prosecute. Josephine's father had known this. He had spoken of it in the careful, measured way that men speak of dangers they are trying not to make more real by naming directly. He had also, as it turned out, known considerably more than he had shared with his daughter. William Harper had died on a Tuesday morning in early July, found by his foreman, a steady man named Pete Varga, face down in the back paddock. The county coroner, a man named Dr. Aldous Creech, who had a comfortable relationship with certain powerful interests in the territory, had written heart failure on the certificate without troubling himself with an examination that might have contradicted the conclusion he had already reached before he arrived. Josephine had not been able to prove otherwise. She had stood at her father's grave in the hard red dirt of the Harper family plot, and she had known, with the certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind, that the word murder was the correct word, and that nobody with the authority to act on it was going to use it. Then she had gone back to the house, and she had started clearing, because grief in the territory was a practical business and you could not afford to let it stop you for long. And on the second day, pulling up a warped board near the back window of her father's study to check the flooring underneath, she had found the space beneath it, and in the space, wrapped in oilcloth, a collection of papers that stopped her heart. Most of them were account records, evidence of payments made to and from parties that her father had clearly understood were dangerous enough to document secretly. There were dates and figures and initials that formed a pattern she could partially read and partially only sense, the way you sense a structure in fog. But among the account records, sealed with the dark red wax and the falcon, was the letter, unopened, addressed in a hand she did not recognize to her father, with no indication of where it had come from or when it had been placed there. She had held it for a long time without opening it. She did not know why she had not opened it immediately. Perhaps because the seal itself frightened her, in a way she could not entirely articulate. Perhaps because something in her understood that the moment she broke it, she crossed into a territory from which there was no return. She had wrapped it back in the oilcloth, put the other papers in the locked box she kept under her own bed, and lay awake through the night making a decision that, by morning, she had already made. She would take it to the marshal. Not because she had particular faith in the official machinery of justice. Her experience with that machinery had been instructive, but because she had no one else, and because, If the letter was what she suspected it was, she needed someone with a badge and a gun to know about it. Someone who could, if necessary, do something about what was inside. She had not anticipated that the marshal himself would recognize the seal. Now she stood in his office in the full, blazing afternoon, watching Jasper Brenner compose himself back into his official shape, watching him pull something tight and controlled back over whatever had cracked open on his face when he saw the letter. And she felt the fear and the fury and the heartbreak of the past 3 days converge into a single, sharp point of focus. "You know the sender," she repeated, and she made it flat, not a question, a statement that required an accounting. "Then tell me who it is." Jasper looked at her for a moment that was too long for a simple answer and too short to be evasion. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Harper." "I have been sitting down for 3 days," she said, "in my father's empty house, sitting with the knowledge that he was murdered and nobody is going to do a single thing about it. I did not ride 40 miles to sit down again." Something shifted in his expression. It was not softness exactly, but it was a crack in the official composure, a brief and involuntary moment of recognition, as if she had said something that matched a private truth he carried. He moved around the desk, and for one confusing second she thought he was coming toward her, but he went past her to the front door of the office and slid the bolt across it, then went to the window and adjusted the shutter so that the angle of the view from outside was blocked. Then he came back and stood across the desk from her and said, very quietly, "The seal belongs to a man named Aldous Crane." She heard the name and felt nothing at first, because it meant nothing. Then she heard it again in her own memory, in a different context, in a different voice. Her father's voice, 3 months ago, speaking to Pete Varga in the barn when they thought she was in the house. Only 2 words caught Crane's man. "Who is Aldous Crane?" she asked. Jasper reached across his desk and opened the bottom left drawer. He took out a folder, worn at the edges, and set it on the desk between them without opening it. His hand rested on top of it for a moment, and she saw that his hand was not entirely steady. "He is a land speculator out of Albuquerque," Jasper said. "He operates through layers of intermediaries and proxies, which makes him very difficult to touch through normal legal channels. He has interests in at least 6 land disputes across the territory, and in each case, the original landowner either sold under duress or died. The deaths have always been attributed to natural causes or accidents." He paused. "I have been building a case against him for 2 years. The words settled over Josephine like a second skin. She felt them change the shape of everything. "And my father," she said. "Your father's land sits directly over the proposed route of a rail spur that Crane has been quietly financing," Jasper said. "If the spur is built, that land triples in value overnight. Crane needs it. He has needed it for at least a year." He looked at her steadily. "I had William Harper on my list of people I was worried about, Miss Harper. I had intended to speak with him." "He is buried," she said. The words came out flat and terrible. "I know, and the way he said it was not official. It was personal in the way that grief is personal, the weight of something he had failed to prevent, and that too she filed away." "Open the letter," she said. He looked at the envelope. "It's addressed to your father. Legally, he is dead," Josephine said. "And I am his heir, and I am asking you to open it in your official capacity, right now in front of me." Jasper Brenner picked up the letter. He reached into his desk for his penknife and worked the seal carefully, preserving it evidence, she understood, preserving evidence, and unfolded the single page inside. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, and she saw the control that cost him, the deliberate stillness, and then at the end something that was very close to cold fury, contained and directed like water in a channel. He set it down and turned it so she could read it. It was short. It said, in the careful hand of a man accustomed to keeping his actual meaning at a remove from his written words, "Harper, the arrangement we discussed has become inconvenient. I require resolution before the end of July. Consider carefully what it would mean for your daughter's future if you choose incorrectly." The seal was intact. The signature was a single initial. C. Josephine read it twice. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. The fury was doing that, burning through the fear and leaving something harder and cleaner in its wake. "He threatened me," she said, "to control my father." "Yes. My father chose incorrectly." Her voice did not break. She was proud of it, distantly, in the way you are proud of small things when the large things are terrible. "And now my father is dead, and whoever Crane sent to resolve the arrangement is still out there, and I am the only person who can connect Crane to my father's murder, except that I cannot prove the murder, and the only doctor in the county belongs to Crane, and I am standing in your office because I have nowhere else to stand." Jasper Brenner looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He pulled out the chair from behind his desk and sat down in it, not the official chair of authority but the simple position of a man thinking hard. He ran one hand along his jaw, and he looked at the letter and the folder and then at her. "You're in danger," he said. "Right now, today. If Crane knows your father didn't sell and didn't comply, and if he knows your father is dead, then whoever he sent will have reported back, and Crane will be calculating what comes next, which includes what to do about William Harper's daughter who inherits William Harper's land." "I know," Josephine said. "I worked that out on the ride here. You rode alone, 40 miles. There was nobody else I trusted to come with me." He looked at her in a way that was not entirely professional. She noticed that too. She was noticing too many things about Jasper Brenner, and she told herself it was because he was the most important person in the room, in a purely tactical sense, and that was all. "You can't go back to the ranch alone," he said. "I cannot stay in Red Rock indefinitely," she said. "I have cattle and a foreman and a property that needs to be managed, and I will not be driven off my land by a man who had my father killed." "I am not suggesting you be driven off anything," Jasper said, and there was something in his tone that was almost sharp, as if the suggestion offended him. "I am suggesting that you not be alone. There is a difference." "What are you suggesting exactly?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been waiting for a piece of direct evidence that connects Crane to specific actions in this territory. This letter is the closest thing I have found. It is not enough on its own, it is elliptical enough that a clever lawyer will find a dozen interpretations, but combined with the financial records you mentioned, and with a formal statement from you about what your father told you," he stopped. "How much did your father tell you?" "Not enough," Josephine said, and the bitterness was there for a moment, honest and unguarded. "He was protecting me, I think. He thought he was protecting me." She pressed her hands flat on the desk again and then lifted them. "He had papers, account records, hidden with the letter. I have them at the ranch." Jasper stood. "Then we need to go get them." It was as simple and as complicated as that. They left Red Rock at 4 in the afternoon, with the sun beginning its long western descent and the shadows of the mesa stretching out across the red earth like something biblical. Jasper rode a gray horse, steady and well-mannered, and Josephine rode her own bay mare, Dolly, who had carried her through 40 miles of desert that morning and was still, irritatingly and admirably, not tired. Jasper had told his deputy, a young man named Ed Marsh, earnest and reliable, that he was conducting official business and would be back by morning. He had not specified the nature of the business. He had, however, told Ed to be watchful, in the particular way that marshals tell their deputies to be watchful when they believe the threat is real and specific. They rode mostly in silence for the first 10 miles. Josephine was tired in a way that she refused to acknowledge fully because acknowledging it would mean stopping, and she could not stop. Jasper rode slightly ahead, not because he knew the road better, she knew this road in the dark, but because he had positioned himself there with the automatic calculation of someone who has spent years thinking about angles and sight lines and the geometry of danger. She noticed this. She also noticed that he rode well, not showily, not with the performed casualness of men who want you to see that they are at home on horseback. He rode the way he existed in general, with a quiet, complete attention to where he was and what was around him, and she found it oddly steadying. After the first water break, when they had pulled up at a shallow creek crossing and let the horses drink, Josephine said, "How do you know Aldous Crane? You said you recognized the seal. That means you have seen it before." Jasper was looking out at the western horizon, where the sky had gone to burnt orange and deep purple, the theatrical extravagance of a New Mexico sunset. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to deflect. Then he said, "I was in Crane's employ briefly 8 years ago. Before I was a lawman." She let that sit in the air between them. "I was 24, he said. I had come west from Missouri with nothing particular in mind, and a fair amount of things behind me that I wanted to leave behind. Crane ran what looked, from the outside, like a legitimate land development operation. I worked as a sort of agent for him, negotiating purchases, that kind of thing." He paused. It became apparent fairly quickly that the negotiating was supplemented by methods I found unacceptable. "I left his employment after 4 months. And became a marshal," Josephine said. "Not immediately. There were a few years in between that I do not particularly recommend as a life plan." He glanced at her. "But eventually, yes. I became a marshal, and I found that the things I had learned in those 4 months about how men like Crane operate were, unfortunately, useful. And you have been trying to bring him down ever since." "It is more complicated than that," he said. "A man like Crane has resources. Lawyers, yes, but also political relationships, territorial officials who owe him favors. You cannot simply ride to Albuquerque and arrest him on the basis of your moral certainty about his guilt. You need evidence. You need evidence that can withstand the kind of legal pressure his resources can generate. And the letter. The letter and your father's account records and anything else we can find may be enough." Together, he looked at her directly. "I am not making you promises I cannot keep, Miss Harper. I want to be precise about that. This is not simple, and it is not fast, and there are real risks between here and any kind of justice. But I believe it is possible." Josephine looked at him. The last of the sunset light was doing things to the angles of his face that she was choosing not to think about. She said, "Why are you telling me this? The part about working for Crane, you did not have to tell me that." He was quiet for a moment. "Because you are trusting me with your life, more or less. And that deserves honesty about who I am." She did not have an answer to that would not reveal more than she was ready to reveal. She clicked her tongue at Dolly and they rode on. They reached the Harper spread as the stars were coming out, thick and brilliant in the moonless sky the way they are in the desert, filling the darkness with such extravagant light that the land below seems almost familiar even when you cannot see it properly. Josephine's foreman, Pete Varga, was still up, a lamp burning in the bunkhouse window, and he came out when he heard the horses, a shotgun in his hands and his face tightly watchful until he saw Josephine, and then the badge on Jasper's chest. "Miss Harper," he said, and the relief in his voice was audible. "I was worried. You rode out before dawn and I didn't know where you'd gone." "I went to get help," she said simply. "This is Marshal Brenner from Red Rock. He is going to help us." Pete looked at Jasper with the careful assessment of a man who has spent his whole life reading people quickly and on whom his safety depended. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Good," he said, and that was all. Josephine went to her room and lifted the locked box from under the bed. She carried it to the kitchen table, where Jasper had set a lamp, and she unlocked it and spread the contents out. The papers were what she had described account records, meticulous and detailed, in her father's careful hand, covering a period of 18 months. Payments received, coded with initials and numbers. Communications logged by date. And a separate page in the back of the box that was a list of names with brief notations beside each one. Jasper went through the papers with the focused attention of a man reading a language he knows but has not spoken for a while. He was careful with everything, setting each page down precisely, going back to cross-reference dates and figures. Josephine made coffee, because there was nothing else useful she could do in that moment, and she set a cup in front of him and took one for herself and sat across the table and watched him work. He had a quality of stillness when he concentrated that she had not encountered in people very often. Most people, when they read, showed something in their face, or their posture, impatience or puzzlement, or the physical restlessness of a mind that wants to move. Jasper read like he was listening to something, entirely present, nothing leaking. "Your father was meticulous," he said without looking up. "He always was." "This is a record of payments made to county officials," he said, pointing to a column. "This initial here, VC, that would be Vincent Creech, the county commissioner, not the coroner, though they are related. And here," he traced a line across a page, "this is a record of payments received. Your father was not paying these men. He was documenting what they were paid by someone else. By Crane. By Crane's proxies, almost certainly." He looked up. "Your father was keeping evidence. He knew what Crane was doing, and he was building a record of it." Josephine felt something tighten in her chest. "He never told me." "He was trying to protect you," Jasper said. And then more gently, with a care that surprised her, "He was also, I think, building towards something. Perhaps toward a moment when someone with the authority to act on it could use what he had gathered." "He just ran out of time," she said. "Yes." Jasper held her gaze. "He ran out of time, but the record he kept did not." They sat with that for a moment. The lamp burned between them, and outside the window the desert was utterly still, the way it is in the deepest hours of the night, and the stars were still blazing through the darkness, indifferent and magnificent. Then Josephine said, "What do we do now?" Jasper set down the papers and picked up his coffee. He was thinking. She could see the working of it behind his eyes, the sorting and weighing of options. "We need to get these papers to Santa Fe, to a federal prosecutor, not a territorial official, because the territorial apparatus is too compromised by Crane's relationships. A federal man." He paused. "I have a contact, a man named Harlow Dent. We were in the Rangers together briefly years ago. He went into federal law. He is honest. I believe he is honest, and he has the authority to pursue this at a level that Crane's territorial connections cannot reach. Can you trust him?" "As much as I can trust anyone in this business," Jasper said, "which is not an unlimited amount, but more than most." "How long will it take to get word to Dent and get him here with an official warrant and the authority to make arrests?" 3 weeks minimum, possibly 5. Josephine looked at her coffee. 5 weeks. During which time you cannot be alone, and the ranch needs to appear as normal as possible. Crane's man, whoever did what was done to your father, will be watching to see what happens next. If things look normal, if the land appears to be in quiet transition with no active dispute, he may wait. He may believe Crane's warning worked after the fact, that you will eventually sell. "I will not sell." "No," Jasper said. "I know you will not. But I need him to believe you might." Josephine set down her cup. "You want to stay here." It was not a question, but it was also not an accusation. It was a recognition of the logical conclusion of everything he had said, laid out plainly, because she was not a woman who benefited from things being said obliquely. Jasper met her gaze. "I am not suggesting anything improper," he said carefully. "Ed Marsh can handle things in Red Rock for a few weeks, and Pete Varga is here. I can set up in the bunkhouse. I can present as a hired hand. I have done that kind of work as it happens." "Yes," she said. "I remember you mentioned the years in between." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the close relative of one, and it did something entirely inconvenient to the structure of her composure. "I can fix fences and move cattle," he said. "I am not useless in a practical sense." "I never thought you were useless," Josephine said. And then, because that had come out differently than she intended, she said, "I will put the papers back in the box tonight, and we will decide in the morning how to get word to your contact in Santa Fe." She stood. He stood. They were on opposite sides of the kitchen table, and the lamp was between them, and the night was very quiet around the house. And Josephine Harper felt, for the first time since she had found the papers in the floorboard, something that was not fear and not fury. It was something much more dangerous than either of those things, and she recognized it with a kind of resigned exasperation, the way you recognize bad weather coming in off the mountains when you have nowhere to shelter. She took the box and she said good night, and she went to her room. In the morning, everything had the quality of an agreed-upon fiction. Jasper had slept in the bunkhouse with Pete, and when Josephine came out at dawn to start the coffee, he was already at the water pump, washed and alert, and he had the look of a man who had slept well or was very good at pretending he had. Pete was fixing harness leather at the bunkhouse door, and the horses were in the paddock, and the ranch looked, from any external vantage point, like an ordinary working spread in an ordinary July morning. Josephine wrote the letter to Harlow Dent in Santa Fe while the coffee was on. Jasper dictated the relevant details in a low voice, precise and efficient, and she translated them into the careful, neutral language of correspondence that would not, if intercepted, reveal exactly what it was. They sent it with the Reedrock mail rider who came through every Wednesday. It was a Thursday, so they had to wait one day, and that one day had a particular texture of barely contained impatience on both sides. The waiting, as it turned out, was also an education. Working alongside Jasper Brenner was nothing like Josephine had expected. She had expected him to be useful in the way that official authority is useful, as a deterrent, as a presence, as a name attached to a badge that complicated the calculations of dangerous men. She had not expected him to actually work. He was up before her most mornings, had coffee made before she came out, had already assessed the day's necessary tasks with Pete and allocated them logically, without taking over or displacing Pete's authority, which she noticed and which Pete noticed, and which appeared to earn Jasper Varga's quiet but genuine respect. He could indeed fix fences. He could also, it turned out, identify a sick calf at 20 yards, sharpen a blade to a degree that Pete declared was almost unreasonable, and make a kind of flat camp bread from cornmeal that was surprisingly good when you were out on the range and hadn't eaten since dawn. They were out on the range together a lot, as it happened. The Harper spread needed its eastern boundary ridden twice weekly to check for the fence gutting that had continued intermittently over the past 2 months, and Jasper took that duty with a focused attention that went well beyond fence maintenance. He was reading the land, she realized, looking for tracks, for patterns, for evidence of surveillance. He did it quietly without making it obvious, and on the third day out he showed her where a horse had stood, partially concealed by a rock formation, at a point that had a clear sight line to the house. "Someone has been watching," he said. He said it without alarm, in the factual tone of a man reporting information, not a threat. Josephine looked at the marks in the hard earth. "How recent?" "4 days ago, maybe 5, before you rode to Reedrock." He crouched and examined something near the base of the rock that she could not resolve into meaning from her position on horseback. One horse, one rider, patient, he stood. "They know how to wait." "Like you," she said, without meaning to. He looked up at her. The sun was behind her and she was backlit, she knew, which made her expression harder to read. His was in full light, and she could see the way the observation landed, not offensively, but with a kind of precision, like an arrow finding the center of a target it didn't know it was aiming at. "Like me," he agreed. They rode back slowly, side by side, and talked. It was the most natural conversation she had had in a long time, possibly since before her father died, possibly longer than that. He told her, in pieces that he offered without her asking, about Missouri, about the particular kind of restlessness that had sent him west at 22. His father had been a farmer, he said, a good man in the way that Josephine's father was described, principled, capable, limited in fortune. His mother had died young too. There were resonances in their histories that Josephine felt rather than analyzed, the way you feel harmonics in music, something that vibrates in a register below conscious thought. She told him things too. About the engagement to Carter Doyle, briefly and without excess detail, enough to explain the particular shape of her independence without making it into a wound. About the accounts she kept, and the satisfaction she found in numbers that told the truth, the particular pleasure of a ledger that balanced. about the way she had felt at 17 when she first understood that her father was genuinely afraid, and how that fear had become so normalized that she had almost stopped being able to identify it as fear. "The letter that frightened him," Jasper said. "When you were 17, what correspondence was that?" "I never saw it directly," she said. "I saw my father's reaction to something he received. He burned it in the fireplace and he sat in his chair for an hour without moving, and then he got up and he was different, quieter, more careful." She paused. "I always thought it was something about money, some financial trouble. I didn't understand then that it was this." "Crane has been moving through this territory for a long time," Jasper said. "Slowly and carefully, he identifies properties with particular value and he begins the pressure years before he needs the land. Some people sell. Some people hold out and then sell. And some people," he stopped. "Some people died," Josephine said. "Yes, how many?" "That I can count with reasonable certainty. 4, that I believe but cannot prove. 8 more." She absorbed that. The desert around them was blazing with afternoon heat, everything sharp-edged and absolutely real, and the number 12 settled into her mind and sat there with a weight that had nothing to do with abstraction. "You're going to stop him," she said, not as a question. "We are going to try." He said it honestly, without the false reassurance that she would have found insulting, and that honesty did something to the architecture of her resistance to him. It was like a wall discovering it had a door in it that it hadn't known about. The response from Harlow Dent arrived 12 days later, which was faster than Jasper had expected, and which he took as a sign that Dent was both still reliable and genuinely interested. The letter was brief, and used the carefully neutral language that federal men used when they suspected their correspondence might be read. It indicated that certain parties were interested in the matters described, and that a representative might be expected within 10 to 14 days, which gave them 10 to 14 days, and the days had a shape to them by then, a daily rhythm that had become, against all of Josephine's intentions and prior patterns, genuinely difficult to imagine ending. On the 14th day of Jasper's presence at the Harper spread, which was a Sunday, it rained. Real rain, not the brief violent thunderstorms that the territory threw at you in July as a kind of atmospheric tantrum, but a steady, generous, hours-long rain that smelled of wet earth and creosote, and filled the dry wash at the south boundary and made the whole landscape exhale with relief. Pete and the 2 other ranch hands took the afternoon as a rest day, which was entirely deserved, and Jasper and Josephine sat on the covered porch and watched the rain. It was the first time in 2 weeks they had been truly idle, both of them at the same time, without a task or a plan or an imminent concern imposing a structure on the moment. Josephine found it slightly alarming. Idle time, she had discovered, gave her thoughts room to move in directions she was not sure she wanted them to move. Jasper had his long legs stretched out in front of him, boots crossed at the ankle, watching the rain with a quality of attention that was not the tense attention of vigilance but something softer pleasure, she thought, the simple pleasure of a man who has spent enough time in dry country to know what rain means. He looked younger when he was not working. The lines of his face were still there, the history in them, but they settled differently when he wasn't carrying something. "How long has it been since you just stopped?" she asked. He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "I genuinely do not know," he said. "That is a troubling answer." "It is an honest one." He glanced at her sideways, and the ghost of that almost smile was there again. "How long for you?" "Longer than I can calculate," she admitted. "Since my mother died, perhaps. Before that there was a different kind of stillness, the kind you have when you are a child and you don't yet understand that everything is precarious. After that it was always movement, always something to manage." "You are very good at managing things," he said. "It was necessary," she said. "Someone had to be." She paused. "Though I suspect you would say the same." "Yes," he said. "Though mine was a different kind of necessity. Yours came from love. Mine came from something less settled initially." She looked at him. The rain was a curtain beyond the porch, silver and steady, and the light had the soft, diffused quality of an overcast afternoon that made everything look slightly less harsh than it usually did. He was looking at the rain and she was looking at him, and she thought, with a clarity that was both inconvenient and impossible to dismiss, that she had not looked at a person this way in a very long time, had not wanted to. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you haven't told anyone." It was an odd thing to ask. She was not even sure why she asked it. He turned to look at her directly, surprised, and the surprise on his face was so genuine, so unguarded, so unlike his normal controlled composure, that she felt as though she'd been given a glimpse of something rare. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am tired of being alone." She did not look away. He did not look away. The rain fell between them and the world, and in the shelter of the porch it was very quiet and very still, and something that had been building for 2 weeks without either of them naming it sat between them now with the solidity of a thing that had been named. "That is a true thing," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his once briefly, and then took it back. His hand had turned under hers before she withdrew it, not grasping, not demanding, just responding, and the warmth of it stayed on her palm like an impression in soft wax. Harlow Dent arrived on a Tuesday, 12 days after his letter, which was within his predicted window, and which Josephine took as a sign of the kind of reliability that matters in a crisis. He was a lean, sun-browned man of about 45, with a federal badge and a thorough, quiet competence that showed itself in the way he read the papers that Josephine had assembled, her father's account records, the letter with Crane's seal, a written statement from Josephine about the events of her father's death and the coroner's report, and a supplemental statement from Pete Varga about what he had seen and heard over the months preceding William Harper's death. Dent read everything twice. He asked questions that were sharp and specific, and that showed he had a thorough prior knowledge of Aldous Crane's methods. He cross-referenced dates with information he had brought with him from Santa Fe records from other cases, other counties, the paper trail of a man who had been careful but not quite careful enough to leave no trail at all. He stayed at the ranch for 3 days, working with Jasper, and on the third evening he sat across the kitchen table from both of them and said, "This is enough. This is enough to take to a federal grand jury in Santa Fe, and I believe it is enough to obtain a warrant for Crane's arrest on charges of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." Josephine felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been carrying for so long it had become structural, like a supporting beam. She felt it go and felt, for a moment, the terrifying lightness of a building that does not know yet if it can stand without the thing that has been holding it up. Jasper said, "The coroner, Creech." "He will be approached," Dent said. "Separately, quietly, with a precise accounting of what we know and what his options are. In my experience, men like Creech fold quickly when they understand that their protection has evaporated." He looked at Jasper. "Crane's territorial connections will not be able to help him with this. I have been careful to keep this entirely within federal channels. The territorial officials who owe him favors will find that the currency they are dealing in has changed." "How long?" Josephine asked. "The grand jury convenes in 8 weeks, Dent said. "We will aim for a warrant within that time frame." 8 weeks. Josephine looked at the table, at her father's handwriting on the pages spread there, at the evidence of the quiet, dangerous work he had done to document the truth of what was being done to him, and she felt the grief of it alongside the justice of it in a way that was almost unbearable, and also, somehow, almost right. "My father would have wanted this," she said. "Yes," Jasper said quietly, "he would have." Dent left the next morning with carefully made copies of everything he needed and a firm handshake for both of them. The originals went back into the locked box under Josephine's bed. In the days after Dent's departure, the ranch settled back into its routine, but the routine had changed, and they both knew it. The acute crisis had passed into a waiting phase, which was different. The danger was not gone. Crane was still out there, His man was still somewhere in the territory, and they had not yet moved on Josephine's land, but the nature of the danger had shifted. It was less immediate, more strategic. Jasper stayed, because both of them acknowledged that his presence was still prudent, and because Pete had explicitly said, with the blunt pragmatism that was his primary mode of communication, that having a second set of eyes and hands was valuable, and that he'd appreciate the marshal staying until things were settled. But the acknowledged reason for his staying was no longer the only reason, and they both knew that too. There was an evening, in the third week of Jasper's time at the Harper spread, when Josephine was working at the kitchen table by lamplight, going through the monthly accounts, and Jasper came in from checking the horses and saw her there, and simply sat down across from her, and read the battered copy of a surveying manual he had found on her father's shelf, and neither of them said anything for 2 hours, and it was the most comfortable 2 hours Josephine could remember. It was also, when she thought about it later in her room, the most frightening thing that had happened since she found the papers in the floorboard. Because Carter Doyle had taught her, definitively, that comfort was a trap, that the feeling of rightness was manufactured by need and loneliness and the simple animal desire for warmth, and that it bore no reliable relationship to the character of the person on the other side of it. She had carried that lesson for 6 years, and it had served her. It had been a cold kind of service, but service nonetheless. The trouble was that Jasper Brenner did not behave like a man who was manufacturing comfort. He behaved like a man who was doing the extremely difficult and countercultural thing of simply being honest, even when honesty was costly and complicated, and doing it consistently, day after day, without the performance of virtue that revealed itself over time as something else entirely. She found herself, on a morning when they were riding the fence line together, saying, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, even if you think the truth is not what I want to hear." "I generally do that," he said, "but go ahead. Why are you still here? Dent has the evidence. The immediate danger is reduced. You have a town and a deputy and a job. Why are you still here?" He rode for a few paces without answering. Dolly snorted at something in the brush to the left, and Josephine brought her back with a quiet hand on the rein, and the question hung in the bright morning air between them. "Because I do not want to leave," Jasper said. And then, before she could process that, "and because I do not think the danger is sufficiently reduced to be comfortable. Crane has not made a move since your father's death, which might mean he is waiting on legal strategy, or it might mean he is waiting on something else. I do not know which, and until I know which, I am not comfortable leaving you with one foreman and 2 hands." "That is 2 reasons," Josephine said. "Yes." "Which one is more true?" "Both of them," he said, "equally. I am not going to rank them for you because I do not think it would be honest to imply that either one supersedes the other." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the line of the fence, at the red earth and the blue sky and the uncomplicated geography of the desert, and his profile was steady and quiet and somehow both more guarded and more vulnerable than she was accustomed to seeing. "I do not know what to do with you," she said. It was more honest than she intended, but she let it stand. "You do not have to do anything with me," he said. "I am not asking for anything." "I know you're not," she said. "That's part of the problem." He turned and looked at her then fully, and she met his gaze, and what passed between them in that moment was not speech and did not need to be. They kept riding, but something had shifted irrevocably, the way the landscape shifts after rain, still the same country, but different, because the water has moved through it and left its trace. 4 weeks after Harlow Dent's departure, the expected move came, though not from the direction they had anticipated. It was a man named Silas Greer, who arrived at the Harper spread one afternoon, riding a good horse, and wearing the kind of clothes that announced prosperity without quite announcing wealth. He had a lawyer's card in his pocket and a carefully pleasant expression on his face, and he introduced himself as a representative of Crane Land Development out of Albuquerque, there to discuss the matter of the Harper property. Josephine came out of the house alone. Jasper had seen the rider coming from the ridge where he'd been working and had come back to the yard, but they had agreed weeks ago on how to handle this eventuality, and the agreed plan was that she would handle it initially, alone and apparently vulnerable, while Jasper watched from a concealed position near the barn. She was not, in fact, vulnerable, but she was willing to let Silas Greer believe she might be. Greer gave her a smooth, sympathetic speech about the loss of her father, about the challenges of managing a ranch as a single woman, about the considerable generosity of the offer his employer was prepared to make for the Harper property. He named a figure that was roughly 2/3 of the land's actual value, which told her everything she needed to know about how much they expected to conceal and how much they were still willing to reveal. She listened with apparent attentiveness and said she would need time to consider the offer and would he like to come back in 2 weeks. He said he would, and he rode away, and Jasper came out from behind the barn wall where he had been standing, and they looked at each other. 2 weeks, she said. Dent estimated 8 weeks for the warrant, he said. We have approximately 5 more to go. Can we stall Greer for 5 weeks? With luck and careful management, he said. Yes, I think we can. They managed it. Josephine met with Greer twice more, each time expressing measured interest in the offer and raising specific, detailed counterpoints about property valuation and water rights, and the legal requirements for transfer of title that required further inquiry and consideration. She was very good at this. The accounts she had kept for the Harper spread for 8 years had given her a thorough understanding of the legal and financial frameworks that governed property in the territory, and she deployed that understanding with a precision that left Greer, each time, visibly uncertain whether he was dealing with a woman who was hesitating or a woman who was outmaneuvering him. She was outmaneuvering him. Jasper knew it and watched it with what she was beginning to recognize as admiration, expressed in the particular way he had of saying very little and paying close attention. In the evenings during those weeks, something grew between them that neither of them rushed and neither of them pulled back from. It was not dramatic. There was no single evening of revelation, no grand declaration. It was quieter than that and more thorough, the way deep water is quiet but has volume and weight and holds things. They talked, more than Josephine had talked to anyone in years. They disagreed sometimes on specifics on approaches, and the disagreements were not comfortable exactly, but they were clean. They went somewhere. They resolved into something, and in the resolving she felt the particular satisfaction of a mind meeting another mind that it does not have to simplify itself for. He told her more about Missouri, about his father's death when Jasper was 19, about the years he had spent drifting before Crane had given his aimlessness a temporary and costly focus. She heard in it the specific loneliness of a man who had learned early to rely only on himself and had made an excellent job of it and was only now slowly, uncertainly, discovering that it was not the only way to live. She told him about her mother, about the particular mathematics of loss when you are 11, how the numbers don't add up, how the world keeps insisting on the arithmetic of normal life while the grief refuses to resolve. She had not talked about her mother to anyone in years, and talking about her to Jasper felt like opening a room that had been closed so long it had its own weather in it, a little cold, a little dark, and then, as the air moved through, gradually, recognizably habitable. There was an evening in the 6th week when they were sitting on the porch again after supper, and Jasper said, without particular preamble, "When this is over, when Crane is arrested and Dent has what he needs and your land is safe, what do you want?" She looked at the stars, which were, as always, extravagant and unconcerned. "To stay," she said. "To keep the ranch. To keep the accounts and the cattle and the work I know how to do." She paused. "And to not be alone. I have changed my mind about being alone." He was quiet. She looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked. He was looking at her, not at the stars, with the full, unguarded attention she had come to know as the most honest version of him. "The same thing," he said. "The same thing exactly." She reached across the space between them and he met her halfway, and when his hand closed around hers, it was not tentative and it was not proprietary. It was the particular warmth of a choice made with full knowledge, and she held on. Harlow Dent's wire arrived on a Thursday morning 7.5 weeks after his departure. It said, "Warrant issued, arrest made, Crane in federal custody in Santa Fe. Greer picked up in Albuquerque same morning. Coroner Creech has given a full statement. The case is closed. You are safe." Josephine read it sitting at the kitchen table with Jasper standing behind her, reading over her shoulder, and when she finished, she set the wire down on the table and pressed both hands flat on the surface and felt, through the wood, the solid and indisputable reality of the earth beneath the house, beneath the ranch, beneath everything her father had built and protected and ultimately given his life to preserve. She wept then. She had not wept since the funeral, which had been held in the hard, practical way of frontier funerals, with no time for the kind of sustained grief that the occasion deserved. She had been too busy surviving to properly grieve, and now the danger was gone and the surviving was done and the grief came through, honest and complete. Jasper pulled a chair beside her and sat in it and did not say anything. He put his arm around her and she turned into him, which was nothing like the cautious, arm's-length propriety she had maintained for 6 years, and she felt the warmth and the solidity of him, and she let herself cry until the crying was finished. Then she straightened, and she pressed the back of her hand against her eyes and she said, "I must look dreadful." "You look like a person who has been carrying too much for too long and has just been allowed to put it down," he said. "You look honest." She looked at him. His arm was still around her, warm and steady, and the morning light was coming in through the kitchen window, and everything, from the coffee cooling on the stove to the wire on the table to the locked box that could now be handed over to Dent and released from her keeping, had the quality of something that had reached its right end. "Jasper," she said. "Yes. I would like you to stay." He did not pretend not to understand what she meant. "I would like to stay," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, which was the first time, and which had nothing tentative in it because she was not a woman who did things tentatively when she had made up her mind, and he kissed her back with the focused, complete attention he brought to everything, and it was, as she had suspected it would be if she was honest with herself, for quite some weeks, exactly right. The weeks that followed had the quality of a country emerging after a long winter. Not effortless, nothing in the territory was effortless, and there was a great deal of practical work to be done. Dent required additional documentation. The territorial officials who had been compromised by Crane's money required careful navigation, and the Harper spread's eastern boundary required rebuilding after months of deliberate damage. But the work had a different quality now, because it was being done in safety, and because it was being done together. Jasper rode to Reed Rock and had a long conversation with his deputy, Ed Marsh, who had been managing the town's affairs reliably, and who turned out, in the course of that conversation, to have an interest in a permanent appointment that Jasper, in his new circumstances, was glad to be able to recommend him for. He tendered his resignation to the county, with the recommendation that Marsh be appointed permanently, which the county, after some deliberation that Jasper suspected was more political than practical, agreed to. He came back to the Harper spread on a Thursday evening with his resignation official, his few personal possessions transferred from his rooms in Reed Rock, and a look on his face that Josephine, who was watching from the porch as he rode in, recognized as something she did not have a precise word for except perhaps released. She came down from the porch to meet him, and he dismounted, and they stood in the yard in the late afternoon light with the smell of dust and horses and her father's good red earth all around them, and he said, "I need to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to say that for longer than is probably respectable, given the circumstances under which we met. But I wanted to wait until I was asking you as myself, as a man with no badge and no official purpose for being here, rather than as a marshal making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "So, I am asking, will you marry me?" Josephine looked at him. She thought about the day she had ridden into his office with trembling hands and a sealed letter, afraid and furious, and convinced she was alone. She thought about the 40 miles of desert between her life and this moment. She thought about her father, who had kept meticulous records in a locked space under his floor and had been trying, right up until the end, to protect her. She thought about what he would have made of this man, this quiet, honest, careful man standing in the yard of the spread he had built and asking his daughter to let him stay in it. She knew what her father would have made of him. She had known, really, for weeks. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed at the obviously, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and it transformed his face entirely. And she thought that she wanted to earn that laugh regularly for the rest of her life. And that was a thought she had never had about anyone before, and she was absolutely certain it was the right one. They were married in September of 1883 in Redrock by the circuit preacher who came through on the second Sunday of the month. The ceremony was held outside, in front of the small adobe church, because the inside could not hold everyone who came. The town of Redrock had, in the 2 months since Crane's arrest, developed a specific opinion about Jasper Brenner's role in breaking up what turned out to be a network of corruption that had affected 6 families in the county, and the opinion was firmly positive. People came from as far as 30 miles to see the wedding, which was a measure of something, of the territory's hunger for events that were genuinely good, perhaps, or simply of the rarity of a story that ended the way stories are supposed to end. Pete Varga cried, which he would have denied vigorously under any questioning, and which both Josephine and Jasper pretended they had not noticed, out of affection and respect. Ed Marsh, now formally appointed as Marshal of Redrock, came with his new wife, a quiet and formidably competent woman named Clara who had arrived in town 2 weeks prior as the new schoolteacher, and who had apparently decided within days that Ed Marsh was worth her attention, a decision that Ed appeared to be in a state of stunned gratitude about. Harlow Dent sent a telegram from Santa Fe which said only, "Well done, both of you. The grand jury has returned indictments on all counts." Josephine wore her mother's best dress, altered to fit, with her dark hair pinned up in a style she had spent an undignified amount of time the previous evening attempting to arrange. And when she came out of the church and saw Jasper standing in the bright September sun, he looked at her the way she had learned to understand he looked at things he found remarkable, with complete, quiet attention, nothing performed, everything real. She walked to him, and they married, and the desert around them was ablaze with the particular golden light of a New Mexico autumn, and the ceremony was simple and direct and honest, which was the only kind of ceremony either of them would have wanted. They went home to the Harper spread, the Brenner-Harper spread, as it became known in the county records, though Josephine privately thought of it simply as home, and the life they built there had the quality of something deliberately and carefully constructed on a solid foundation. Not perfect, because nothing in the territory was perfect, and nothing undertaken by 2 people who are both accustomed to solving things alone is ever entirely without friction. But good. Deeply, thoroughly good, in the way that things are good when they are true. The cattle business strengthened in the following year, partly because of Jasper's practical contributions to the operation, and partly because Josephine's management, freed from the burden of constant vigilance, became what it had always had the potential to be, genuinely excellent. She implemented a system of rotational grazing that Pete had been skeptical of, and then enthusiastic about when it demonstrably improved the condition of the stock. And she expanded the herd by 30 animals in the spring of 1884 by a careful process of selective purchase that she had researched through agricultural correspondence with the land-grant college in Las Cruces. Jasper, who was no longer a marshal but who had accumulated enough understanding of the territory's legal and practical landscape to be broadly useful, took on the role of county land assessor, when the position was offered to him in early 1884. It was a quieter life than the law, and the quietness suited him. He was, Josephine observed, a man who had spent years in pursuit of the thing he believed in, and now that the thing was achieved, or the specific version of it that had driven him for a decade, he was discovering with apparent contentment that the pursuit itself was not what he had wanted. What he had wanted was the same thing he'd told her on the porch in the rain: to stop. He was very good at stopping, it turned out, once he allowed himself to do it. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy, and they named him William for Josephine's father, because there was no name either of them could think of that was more right than that. He was a large, enthusiastic infant with Josephine's dark eyes and Jasper's tendency toward focused silence when something interested him, which in his first year manifested as a great, concentrated attention to anything that moved, including but not limited to horses, clouds, sparrows, and the particular way lamplight moved across a table. Pete Varga took one look at him and said, "He's going to be trouble," in a tone of complete approval. Jasper was the kind of father that surprised people who had expected him to be remote. He was not remote with the baby. He was with the boy the way he was with everything he cared about: attentive, present, not performative. He rocked William through the nights of teething with the same patient efficiency he had brought to fixing fences and working cattle, which Josephine found endlessly endearing and also slightly annoying, because the efficiency implied he was not finding it as exhausting as she was, and she was quite certain he was and simply not showing it. She told him this one night in the particular small hours when the baby had finally gone back to sleep and they were both lying in the not quite dark of their room, too tired to sleep, and he said, "I am finding it extremely exhausting. I simply did not think complaining would help." "It would help," she said. "It would make me feel less alone in the exhaustion." "Then I am very tired," he said. "I am genuinely, profoundly tired." She laughed quietly, so as not to wake the baby, and turned toward him, and he pulled her close, and they were both too tired to do anything but be there in the warmth of it. And that, too, she thought, was a kind of love, the specific love of two people choosing each other in the ordinary and unglamorous moments as well as the important ones. Their second child came in 1887, a girl they named Rose, for no specific reason except that she arrived in June when the wild roses along the wash were in bloom, and they looked at her and looked at each other, and the name was simply there. She was smaller than William had been and quieter, with Jasper's gray eyes and Josephine's stubbornness, which last quality became apparent early and remained consistent. William, by then too, regarded his sister with the careful attention of someone assessing a new variable in a known equation, and then, having apparently completed his assessment, appointed himself her guardian with a serious and proprietary thoroughness that made Pete Varga declare again that the boy was going to be something. In the autumn of 1887, Harlow Dent sent a letter, not a telegram, which meant he had things to say that required proper sentences. The letter informed them that Aldous Crane had been convicted on all federal charges and sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Santa Fe. Vincent Creech, the county commissioner, had received a lesser sentence in exchange for his full cooperation and his testimony against Crane. Dr. Aldous Creech, the coroner, no relation to the commissioner, despite the initial confusion of the shared name, had had his medical license revoked and his appointment terminated, and a new county coroner had been appointed, a woman from Albuquerque named Dr. Frances Pell, whose credentials were impeccable and whose appointment Dent described with quiet satisfaction as the most practically useful consequence of the whole business. And Crane Land Development, the entity through which Aldous Crane had conducted 20 years of extortion and fraud and worse across the New Mexico territory, had been formally dissolved, its assets seized, and its records turned over to federal investigators who were using them to pursue similar cases in Arizona and Colorado. Josephine read the letter at the kitchen table while Jasper looked over her shoulder, and when she finished, she folded it carefully and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Justice," she said. "Yes," Jasper said, "late but real." "He would have been glad," she said. She did not have to specify who. She never had to specify with Jasper. "He would have been glad," Jasper agreed. She looked at the window, where the morning light was coming in clear and gold over the eastern mesa, and she thought about her father's careful handwriting in those account books, the patient, dangerous work of a man who had understood what he was up against and had done what he could alone without knowing if it would be enough. She thought about the letter in its oilcloth wrapping, the dark red seal, the 4 words that had detonated everything. "I know the sender." She thought about walking into Jasper Brenner's office with her hands trembling and her heart in pieces, not knowing what she was going to find and finding, entirely against her expectations and prior experience, something that was true. "Thank you," she said. He came around the table and sat beside her, and she leaned into him, and his arm came around her easily, naturally, in the way of people who have learned each other's gravity. Outside, she could hear William's voice in the yard, his running commentary on the chickens, whom he regarded as both inferior and fascinating, and beyond that the sound of Pete at the pump, and the horses moving in the paddock, and the wind along the ridge. The ranch was alive with all the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning, and it was hers, and it was safe, and she was not alone. Through the winter of 1887 and into the spring of 1888, life on the Brenner Harper spread deepened and settled in the way that life does when danger is resolved, and time is permitted to do what it does with people who are genuinely suited to each other. Jasper's work as county assessor kept him engaged and occasionally outraged. There were still men in the territory who confused land development with predation, and while none of them rose to Crane's scale or ambition, dealing with their machinations gave Jasper a purposeful use for the particular skill set he had spent his adult life developing. Josephine expanded her involvement in the county's affairs beyond the ranch itself. The case against Crane had made her name known in ways she had not anticipated, and she was asked, in the spring of 1888, to sit on a newly formed county board that was reviewing land title disputes with an eye toward identifying and correcting fraudulent claims. She was the only woman on the board, which generated a certain amount of friction with certain board members of a traditional persuasion, and she handled the friction with the precision and patience she had brought to outlasting Silas Greer's repeated attempts to secure a sale, which was to say, very effectively. Pete Varga, who had been with the Harper spread since before Josephine could remember, made noises about retiring around this time, and was persuaded to stay by the combined arguments of Josephine's genuine distress at the idea of losing him, and Jasper's practical observation that there was nobody better to train the 2 new hands they needed to hire as the operation grew. Pete grumbled that he was being managed and stayed, and was clearly pleased about it. By 1889, when the territory of New Mexico was making the first serious movements toward statehood that would ultimately bear fruit 22 years later, the Harper-Brenner Ranch had grown from a modest operation to one of the more stable mid-sized cattle spreads in the county. William, 4 years old, was already deeply interested in horses in the specifically serious way that suggested this interest would be lifelong and probably structural. Rose, too, had developed a vocabulary well in advance of any expectation, and a habit of expressing it continuously that her mother found both familiar and mildly alarming. Josephine found, in the spring of 1889, that she was expecting again, and told Jasper on a Tuesday evening after supper when the children were in bed, and they were on the porch in the warm May dark, and he looked at her in the silence after, and what was on his face was something she had no word for except full, a fullness that had nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with something that a man feels when his life exceeds what he had believed he deserved from it. "A third," he said. "Apparently," she said. How are you feeling?" "I feel that I am going to need a larger kitchen table," she said, "and that everything is exactly as it should be." He took her hand, and they sat in the comfortable dark of the porch with the spring night opening around them, and the stars doing their extravagant, indifferent work overhead, and Josephine Harper, Josephine Brenner, though she had kept Harper in the name because it was her father's name, and she would keep it thought about the girl who had ridden 40 miles through desert darkness with a sealed letter in trembling hands, terrified and certain she was alone. She thought about how wrong that certainty had been. The third child arrived in November of 1889, another boy, who came into the world with a good deal of noise and an immediately apparent opinion about being cold, which he communicated clearly and at length until he was warm. They named him Thomas, for no one in particular, and for the sake of a name that was solid and ordinary and entirely his own. William inspected him with the air of an experienced foreman assessing a new situation, and Rose, who had been told she was getting a brother, said, "He is very small," with the tone of someone registering a disappointing but not disqualifying fact. Jasper held Thomas on the first night, sitting in the chair by the window while Josephine slept the deep sleep of the genuinely exhausted, and the baby settled against his chest with the specific boneless weight of the newborn, and the night was very quiet around the house, and the stars were doing what stars do in the New Mexico desert, blazing with an intensity that made the darkness beside them seem gentle by comparison. He sat there for a long time, not thinking exactly but inhabiting. The way a man inhabits a moment he understands is one of the ones that will define the shape of everything before and after it. He thought about a boy in Missouri who had lost his mother young and his father young, and had gone west with nothing particular, and had done nothing particularly admirable with the years that followed. And he thought about what that boy would have thought if you had told him what was in this room, the sleeping woman, the children, the house that was solid and safe and earned. He thought that boy would not have believed it, would not have known how to believe in something so entire. Josephine stirred and opened her eyes and saw him there and smiled without speaking, and he smiled back in the quiet, and the baby between them slept. In the years that followed, as the 1880s gave way to the 1890s, and the territory pressed slowly and haltingly toward the future it would eventually claim, the Brenner-Harper Ranch went on in the way that things go on when they have been built on solid ground by people who understand that the building is never quite finished, and that this is not a tragedy, but a condition of being alive. There were dry summers and hard winters and cattle lost to disease, and one terrible season in 1893 when the grass failed, and they had to make decisions about the herd that cost money they did not have to spare. There were also good years, abundantly good years, when the cattle were fat and the accounts balanced so cleanly that Josephine sat back from the ledger with a satisfaction that was physical, that lived in the body like warmth. William grew into a young man who was extraordinarily good with horses and had, beneath his father's quiet watchfulness, his mother's absolute certainty about what was right and the willingness to act on it. Rose grew into something that nobody had quite predicted, sharp and warm and extraordinarily funny, with a gift for the kind of observation that makes people uncomfortable in the best possible way. Thomas was simply himself, solid and cheerful and competent, the kind of person around whom things work. Pete Varga did, eventually, retire. He went to Albuquerque, where his sister lived, and they received occasional letters that were brief and factual, and ended with Pete's version of affection, which was a declaration that the ranch probably hadn't gone to ruin yet, and he supposed that was all right. Josephine wrote back every time, long letters, telling him about the children and the cattle and the board's work, and the slow advance of the territory toward statehood, and she knew he read them because his replies always contained a specific reference to something she had mentioned, buried in the practical report like a piece of warmth he had wrapped in practicality, so it wouldn't show too much. Harlow Dent came to visit in 1894, retired from federal service and traveling through the territory on what he described as a survey of places he had meant to see properly, and had always been too occupied to visit. He sat on the Brenner Harper porch and drank coffee and watched William with the horses, and Rose with a book and Thomas chasing something in the yard with the whole-body commitment of an 8-year-old. And he said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has seen many things and can assess the value of specific outcomes, "You know, in 20 years of federal work, this is one of the 3 or 4 cases I look back on with no ambivalence at all," Josephine said, "because of the outcome." "Because of all of it," Dent said. "Because your father kept those records and you found them and had the sense to take them somewhere useful. Because Jasper was there to receive them. Because the evidence was real and the warrant was sound and the indictments held up and the conviction stuck." He paused. "Because you two were too stubborn to be frightened off." "I was frightened," Josephine said. "Yes," Dent said, "but you rode 40 miles anyway." Jasper, from his chair, looked at her the way he had looked at her across his desk in that first moment, the way he had looked at her on a rainy porch and on a moonlit ridge and in a kitchen at midnight and at the altar in front of the whole town of Raydrock, with that complete, unperformed attention, with the look of a man who knows exactly what he is seeing and considers it the best thing he has ever seen. She looked back. This was the thing she had not known, at 26, riding into Raydrock with a sealed letter and a breaking heart, was possible. She had known love could be practical, could be enduring, could be the quiet partnership of 2 people managing their lives in parallel. She had seen that in her parents before her mother died. She had not known it could be this continuous present tense thing, this daily choice that remained year after year, genuinely a choice rather than a habit, because he was genuinely interesting and she remained genuinely interested, and they both, somehow, kept managing to surprise each other. She had not known it could be as large as this and as ordinary as this simultaneously, that it could contain within it a porch conversation and a frightened midnight, and a dying father's hidden records, and a rainstorm and a federal warrant and a boy who loved horses and a girl who was probably going to change something significant about the world, and a baby who was now a solid 8-year-old chasing things in the yard. She had not known love could hold all of that and still be at its center, what it was: simple, clear, and absolutely certain. The evening light was settling over the mesa in the particular deep gold of a New Mexico autumn evening, and the desert was going quiet the way it goes quiet in the last hour before dark. And Josephine Harper Brenner sat on the porch of the home her father had built and that she had fought for, and that she had filled with a life she had not dared, at 26, to imagine, and she was at peace. Not the peace of nothing happening, the peace of everything having happened and having landed right. Jasper's hand found hers in the way it always did, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply there. She held on. He held back. The stars, when they came, were extraordinary. They always were, out here. They always had been, and they would be, for as long as there was darkness to hold them and eyes willing to look up.